everyone. This is Mallory Wood, Director of Marketing at mStoner. I'm excited to welcome you all to today's webinar, inspired by the Cheshire Cat Strategy Leads to Success. So I know we've got some webinar veterans in here, so you all know what I'm going to ask you to do right now. Raise your hand or tweet me if you can actually hear me. We just love to do an audio check at the beginning of every webinar because, well, if you can't hear us, then we're talking to nobody. All right, so it sounds like might be a little scratchy, but you can hear me, and luckily the good thing is I'm not going to be talking for too long. So let's go through the housekeeping items really quickly. I'll introduce Susan and we'll get on our way. So first of all, we are definitely recording today's webinar. We record all of our webinars, and you will get an email with a link to the archive and the slides within 48 hours. So if you have colleagues or friends who you think would benefit from the information that Susan shares with you today, absolutely send them the link to the archive. So you will get that from us within 48 hours. Second of all, today's hashtag for the webinar is HE Strategy, for higher ed strategy. So hashtag HE Strategy. I'll be tweeting in the back channel. I know there's a number of you guys in this webinar who like to tweet too. I'm already seeing them come through on Twitter, so looking forward to chatting with you during the webinar on Twitter. And finally, during the webinar, you can absolutely ask questions. Susan is going to leave 10 minutes at the end or so for Q&A, and there's the questions feature within the GoToWebinar control panel that you can use. There's also Twitter, of course, as a way to ask questions. So I'll record them all down as you're asking them, and then we'll run through them all right at the end. So let's get started without further ado. Today's presenter is Susan Evans, a veteran webinar presenter at this point, and she is a senior strategist at mStoner. So as a senior strategist, Susan helps institutions tell their story in print and on the web. Before mStoner, Susan spent over 20 years directing communications, marketing, and technology at the College of William and Mary. And in her career, she has presented at regional and national conferences, including High Web, CASE, and the American Marketing Association Symposium. So you can also tweet Susan today. Her Twitter handle is Susan T. Evans, and I'll see you, I guess, on Twitter. So Susan, I'll turn this session over to you. Let's get rolling.
Well, hello, everyone. I've been really looking forward to this webinar. Our topic today is one that I particularly enjoy talking about. And as I meet with higher education marketing and communications professionals across the country, I've learned that strategy is something that a lot of folks are struggling with and a lot of folks would like to do better. So as Mallory's already mentioned, I'm the senior strategist at mStoner. And I thought I'd give you just a little bit of additional background about me. I joined mStoner about 18 months ago, and I lead one of our consulting teams. And our teams develop communication, marketing, and digital strategy for clients. And as Mallory's already mentioned, before mStoner, I was the first director of creative services at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I still live in Williamsburg, and I think we may even have a few William and Mary folks on the webinar this afternoon. So hello, William and Mary. William and Mary Creative Services is a central marketing and communications unit, and I was responsible for the William and Mary web presence, social media, photography, video, university publications, and the content management system. And since I spent such a long time at William & Mary, not all of that was creative services. I spent about 12 years as the director of web services working for the CIO, and before that about 9 years in HR. So enough about me. Let's start by a reminder about our hashtag. Let's get some attention today for communication strategy. Let's really kind of burn up Twitter with HE Strategy and make sure that everybody out there knows how important it is for our communications efforts. And speaking of Twitter, here's a sponsored tweet. This afternoon I'm going to be talking about strategy, about the idea that you just can't do some stuff and hope for the best. Because if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And this theme or this phrase was inspired, of course, by Alice in Wonderland. I'm not sure that that phrase is actually used in the book or the movie, but you all probably remember the conversation between Alice and the Cheshire Cat when she says she wants to know which way to go, And the cat says, well, it depends on where you want to end up. And if you don't know where you want to end up, it doesn't matter much which way you go. So we're all working really hard trying to tell the story of our campus. And I've already mentioned that I worked at William & Mary for a really, really long time. And since leaving William & Mary during my time at mStoner, which has only, as I mentioned, been about 18 months, I've already worked with more than 15 different colleges and universities and independent schools. And I know now, even more than I knew when I was at William & Mary, I know in my bones that the only way we can distinguish your institution from the one down the road or the one state over is to be more strategic. Beyond my time working in marketing and communications, I also had the chance to view what we do from the perspective of a parent. When my son Jack and my daughter Rebecca were applying to colleges, I went along on 16 campus tours. It wasn't that long ago, so I remember these pretty vividly. I'm certain that probably a lot of you have had similar opportunities to go on campus tours, and if so, you may know what I'm about to say. Frankly, we're all saying the same stuff about our campuses. We're all talking about the special community we have. We're all talking about small classes, the opportunity to connect with professors, the percentage of students who study abroad, how engaged our students are in service learning and community service. And to that, I say, wah, 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 wah. We really start to sound like the Charlie Brown TV show. When the teacher talked, we are all saying a lot of the same things, and it becomes more and more difficult to distinguish ourselves. In fact, both of my children during these tours turned to me at one point and said, didn't they say this at the last campus we visited? So it really is a challenge for all of us. And in fact, we're also similar that we've actually become a stereotype. I don't know if anybody knows about a new movie called Monsters University, and there's a companion website that I'm showing here. Turns out Disney Pixar is shooting this movie that's a prequel to Monsters, Inc. The movie is going to be released in July, and it's the story of two monsters who met in college and were in the same fraternity. So next time you have an hour to waste, check out the Monsters University website. It is a hoot and a stellar example of how similar our messages are to prospective students. It's really a lot of fun to look at. And just to prove my point, I thought I'd read a paragraph from the alumni page on the Monsters U site. As advisors and ambassadors, MU alumni are the driving force for the university's leadership in the world. MU seeks to stay connected with alumni through outstanding programs, regular events, and useful services. There are numerous ways to stay involved. Attend an event. Join your local alumni chapter. Seeking intern or employee talent? Don't forget MU's Monsters Hiring Monsters initiative. And just in case there are still some skeptics among you that aren't quite sure that we really do all sound the same, I'm keeping this slide here, although I won't be playing the admission video today. But if you have an opportunity, once we share the slide, please come back. And I think Mallory's actually going to chat this link out during the webinar, so I'm running the risk that you're all going to be listening to this cute little video instead of to me. But it just, again, demonstrates how much we're all sounding the same in our admissions materials as well. Oops. Sorry, guys. All right, so strategy. Let's talk about some specifics here. What is it? It's essentially a detailed plan of action encompassing a long period of time to achieve a complicated goal. So let's say that again. It's a general, undetailed plan of action encompassing a long period of time to achieve a complicated goal. Now, this word actually came and was originally tied to military tactics, which is kind of interesting. The other thing about strategy is that it is intentional. You're supposed to do this on purpose. It's not supposed to just happen accidentally. It includes an efficient use of your resources. It is a set of options to think about, and it's a course of action. So whenever I talk about what something is, it's sometimes helpful to talk about what it is not. So it's not just a buzzword. It's not a detailed plan, in fact, and it's not the tactics that you use. And it is most definitely not the phase that you skip because you've waited so long to start the project and you just don't want to waste any more time. You just want to get started. So let's think about a couple of questions that you can answer when you're formulating a communication strategy. Here are just a few. We can ask, who is the audience for this initiative? Most of us don't have too much trouble answering that question. What do we want to tell them? And even that is something that we all feel fairly comfortable with, those first two questions. So who are we talking to, and what do we want to tell them? Where it gets a bit tricky is answering the question, why should they care? And then what do we want them to do? In my view, strategy is as much about what you don't do as it is about what you do first. Without a strategy to guide your choices, everything seems like a reasonable option. And when you do have a strategy, following it takes discipline. Let's use social media as an example here. Social platforms that we might choose to include in our communication strategy are free, so there's no barrier to entry, and they're filled with whiz-bang that sometimes distracts us. But our strategic priorities can help us decide which platforms we want to be part of, so what we want to do first and what we don't want to do. Here's another example. If your strategy calls for a focus on recruiting students in a particular geographic area, then publishing an incredible new view book and a companion microsite for admissions has to take priority over a request that you might have to design a services brochure for student affairs. When you're focusing on what's strategic, some options won't make the cut. You should insist on strategy to guide your way and to help you with decision making. So we've covered the what of strategy. You can probably figure out that I'm going to go to another W word, which is the when. When should you develop a strategy? First, let's start with the ideal. Ideally, you put a strategy in place before you start. Now, I worked on a campus long enough to know that that's not always what happens, but it's still the ideal. In the best of circumstances, you want to create strategy before you start, because these upfront discussions that you will have can help you get buy-in, and it can make the roles and responsibilities clearer, and it will also force clarity on who the executive sponsor for the work that you will do will be, and it's a great foundation for planning. I also think strategy work can and should happen as you go along, too. We do the best we can to create a strategy that makes sense before we start, but there's no test like the real thing. So strategy often has to be reworked and reconsidered as we get more information and complete information. And I think strategy is also a great reminder of what we're trying to accomplish. It helps to keep us focused. So while underway, you can also use the strategy you have in place as the core of a broad communications about your project or your initiative, and to help keep expectations in place. You'll find yourself repeating the tenets of your strategy as you remind people about your goal. So in the midst of a really long committee meeting, or in the midst of 1,000 email messages flying back and forth about a particular decision or getting feedback on a particular option, you can use strategy to keep expectations in check and to make sure that everybody understands and can be reminded about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. In my opinion, people often get deadly serious about strategy once they see some warning signs that things aren't going well on a project without it. So once trouble starts, especially if you skipped the strategy discussions and you dived right into the work, it's not too late to rewind a bit and to get things back on track. So sometimes you have to gain support from people while you have their attention. I always say don't waste a great crisis. While you have everyone's attention because people are worried about a project that might be starting to go south, you can often get the resources that you need to be successful at that point. So that can be a real silver lining inside a cloud of a project that may not be proceeding like you'd like it to. So we've talked about what and we've talked about when. Let's talk about the why. Maybe you're not convinced. Maybe you think strategy is a bunch of big think, not practical for your context, something that is just a bunch of mucky-muck higher-up people sit around and talk about that really doesn't have a lot to do with the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. And if those are your impressions about strategy, then I say cue the Cheshire Cat. First, where do you want to go? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. But here are a few other reasons in addition to that one about why I think strategy is a good idea. Strategy includes setting goals. If you don't have goals, how will you know when you're successful? And more importantly, sometimes, how will you know when you're done? How will you know when you've accomplished what you set out to if you don't have any upfront metrics created that help you determine that? Marketing and communications work is also filled with a lot of decisions, some of them large and some of them small. But no matter how small or how large, they all add up over time and create a circumstance that you either like or don't like. And let's think for a minute about how decisions are made within higher ed. It's time, we're only on slide 27, but it's time for the C word. Probably you all know what I'm about to say, and that's consensus, right? Sometimes we have a yes decision, sometimes a no decision, but often on our campuses we have the one that everyone will agree to. But does that consensus about the work always lead us to the right answer? Wouldn't it be easier to make decisions and to make the right choices if our thinking was grounded in strategic goals and not just grounded in whatever is easy to get everybody to agree to? I have a question, and this is an audience where I think I would see a lot of hands raised in response if I could see you. I'm assuming that a lot of you, and the question is, who has attended the reveal of some sort of creative work, either revealing creative work to a client or at a meeting of the department or at a meeting of your senior leadership. Anybody who's ever attended the unveil of any creative for a website or a postcard or a video has seen what happens when we move ahead without first doing the difficult work of strategy. So here's what I mean. Let's pretend this is a comp for an online magazine. You know how this goes, right? You're presenting it to a leadership team or to an advisory committee. The first thing we talk about is the colors. So my question is, does our strategy include a visual identity system? Are there guidelines in place that we need to follow and be consistent with? And if it does, then you don't need to have that painful discussion about color and logo and typeface. If you can follow the guidelines of a visual identity system that's within your strategy, then that's a good thing. After color, we typically move to photo choice, and it usually goes something like this. I don't like that photo. I know that alumni like to see profiles of faculty research, but that professor was featured last year, and I think this press release about our rankings should be used instead of that photo. I could go on all day with this, so I think we better move on. Anyone know what I'm getting at with this slide? Getting all the right people together to talk about strategy helps you figure out what's included and what's not. Yes, we could shoot photography at all the beautiful spots on campus, but if our strategy is to highlight exceptional science programs to high ability students, then what we really need is a range of lab and classroom shots and not beauty shots. Expectations and limitations are often identified during an upfront strategy phase, and these expectations and limits are a lot more easily negotiated at the start. It's also better and sometimes easier to build in expectations that you find out and limitations that you find out at the beginning rather than having to retrofit them later. So let's suppose that you're with me and you understand the importance of strategy. You know that it needs to happen up front. You know that it's critical to success of communication efforts, but maybe you can't get the folks on your campus to hear you. What do you do if you can't convince the people in charge that a strategy phase is important? And I think we all need to stop for a moment and think about the roles of folks on our campus in leadership positions. I mean, our campuses are so broad and so diverse that folks who are leaders have a lot of things they could pay attention to. And sometimes when they're not responding in the way we'd like them to, I don't know that it's necessarily because they don't think that what you're saying is important, but maybe you're not giving them all the reasons that they need to understand why they need to pay attention to this particular thing at this particular moment. So let's talk a little bit about what you might say to people in positions of leadership when someone's trying to move ahead without strategy. The first thing to think about is time. Without a strategy in place, the work is almost guaranteed to take more time than you expect it to. And the reason for that is without a strategy, without a set of goals and ideals that you're trying to follow, every decision becomes a one-off. You haven't narrowed options based on strategic goals, and when you haven't narrowed your options, you end up having to talk about every possibility as if it's equal to every other possibility. And all that talk about things that could be solved by strategy takes time. And the time that you're spending talking about things that are not part of what you're trying to accomplish is wasted, because you could be spending it on high-value work that supports your goals. Another reason that strategy is important is in thinking about scope. Now, scope always creeps. There's never a question of whether or not what you plan to do gets larger. It's just a matter of how much that scope is going to creep. And it's incredibly difficult to control the scope of the work without a strategy, and you're likely to end up with this sort of kitchen sink approach to things where everything is thrown in. Because as you start particularly a large campus-wide initiative at your college or university, people are looking for things that they can glom on to your project. I mean, everybody's looking for ways to make their lives easier, make their jobs better, make them better able to manage their jobs. And so it's really not surprising that as you go from meeting to meeting, people will start to talk about things that could be included. So I think that these upfront strategy discussions are especially important because if you want to launch or publish or go live, you have to have an endpoint. And the limits to what you're doing, the defined scope, means that you're going to actually finish what it is that you're doing. And you'll focus on priorities. And speaking of priorities, that's another area where without strategy, priorities can get changed and become unclear. I mentioned as we were starting that I've had the chance to work with more than 15 schools during my time at mStoner. And I've also visited a lot of campuses in my career. And I can tell you that so far I've never been to a campus where there are unlimited resources for marketing and communication. Nobody's saying to me, hey, we got all the time you need, we got all the money you need, we got all the staff you need to do whatever it is you come up with. So when you have limited and lean resources, and we all do, it means that you have to prioritize. Without strategy, it's a fight to figure out what is the most important thing to focus on. Without priorities that come from a strategy, any garden path seems reasonable. And this might mean that your work goes off the rails. Or worse, it will be easier to stop. If no one understands what your goals are, if you haven't used your strategy phase as a way to get buy-in, as a way to communicate to your campus community, then people aren't going to understand why the project's important anyway. And because you don't know what your goals are, your project is at risk. Skipping strategy means that you haven't fully educated the people in charge, and they may end up stopping the project. Skipping strategy also means that you haven't fully educated the people who are your stakeholders or your internal constituents, and they may work to stop the project. Another reason that strategy is important and not something that you should skip is we all want exceptional communications. And those of us who do this work know that it involves bold elements that stake a claim and take a risk. Without early buy-in from leadership on your campus, incredible creative that's just right for the target audience might be influenced by the naysayers, and it ultimately might be recast as the vanilla option. So let me give you an example of resisting the vanilla from my time at William & Mary. I was responsible for relaunching the William & Mary website about 5 years ago. And as part of that effort, we were writing all new copy for the top-level landing pages. So for about and academics and admission, all those sort of secondary home pages that you get to from your home page. Here are a few sentences from the academics landing page on the William & Mary website. Academic life at William & Mary is spread across 5 schools and dozens of academic departments. If we do our job right, then you'll set foot in nearly all of them. Our students are too multi-talented and intellectually curious to be pigeonholed as a chemistry major or a law student. Now, I had to fight pretty hard for that copy. I had several conversations with one of our deans about the fact that the copy supported our messaging about academics, about the fact that the William & Mary experience was an exceptional one. And it also supported the William & Mary brand as an academic powerhouse. It took a couple of meetings, but I finally convinced her that she didn't need to be concerned about the promise that was being made with this copy. She didn't need to be concerned that a student would someday show up in her office asking why she hadn't taken a class in every department and why this, as the school had guaranteed on the website. So let's talk about why we resist strategy. Why is it so hard? Why do we want to skip right past the strategy phase? As I've already mentioned, sometimes it comes from the fact that we wait so long to kick off these projects that we simply can't wait to get started. But here's why, in my opinion. Strategy is difficult. You have to get the right people in the room, and that takes time. And then you need to have them have some pretty important discussions. You have to take the risks necessary to focus on what's important. And some things that are important won't make the cut. And strategy requires decisions. And you often need to educate the people whose job it is to support those decisions and ultimately approve the strategy. So when you at last get funding or a green light for a new marketing initiative, you might be frustrated about any pauses for discussions about goals. You might want to fast track the meetings about purpose and audience. And you may be thinking, why can't we just get started? We know who we are. We know what we need. And this is particularly a risk for people in creative or communications or marketing or technology positions that have been at an institution for a really long time. Institutions change, audiences change, so it's never a bad investment of time to stop and examine who you are, even if you think you know who that is. And actually, I think strategy is starting. The strategy phase that we use in all of the projects that we do at mStoner is really foundational. It drives everything we do. It helps us make decisions about creative and technology and content and editorial and CMS selection. So we sometimes view strategy as this upfront phase that we have to do before we start, and I say strategy is starting. So I have 5 big ideas about the how to develop a strategy. And as Mallory's already mentioned, we're going to have plenty of time at the end of this set of slides to talk a little bit about some of your challenges and some of your concerns, and hopefully we can have some good conversation about that. Often we have more questions than we have time for, so I know that Mallory will be keeping track of what those are, and I'll certainly see them on Twitter, and we can follow up on those via Twitter and also on the mStoner blog. All right, so 5 big ideas about how to develop strategy. First one, it needs to be custom. No cookie-cutter strategies, which means just because it works for the school down the street or for the school that you came from, if you've been in higher ed for a while and changed institutions, your strategy should be custom for your institution, and it needs to include your campus culture and your sense of place. So the questions that you answer when you're thinking about a custom strategy that's not a cookie cutter of some other institution, what do students and faculty talk about when they talk about you? What do they say about how your particular combination of mission and location and programming meets their particular combination of ambition and ability and personality? Strategy is about understanding your brand, understanding your reputation, and helping you find better ways to communicate that brand. To be honest, I don't know how you write or design something without some sense of what you're trying to say and who you're trying to say it to and why they should care. So I challenge all of you to start to think about why the communication work that you're doing should matter to the audiences that you're trying to reach. It's a really hard question to answer, but if you can start to chip away at that, I think you can really make a huge difference in your communications effort. So the bottom line on this one is that your strategy should let you be you. Also, I think your strategy needs to be comprehensive. We have enough silos on our campuses without adding strategy silos, so be careful about that. Remember that your brand strategy, your mobile strategy, your social strategy, your content strategy, creative strategy, technical strategy, and governance strategy aren't isolated. they all belong together as elements of an overall communication strategy. And there's probably things I've left off, but you get the idea that when you're thinking strategically about communications, you can't operate in silos. You can't create strategies that are separate from one another because you're losing some powerful opportunity and you're running the risk of working at cross purposes. Number 3, let them have a stake. Now, the them are all the people on your campuses who want to be involved in whatever it is that you're doing. And so there are faculty that have an opinion. There are students who have a concern or an idea or a thought. There are staff members who have problems that they need to have solved. All the people on your campus, all your stakeholders, internal and external, need to have a stake in your communication efforts. You need to do a lot of listening when you're developing strategy. When you listen to your constituents during strategy, there's a couple of things that happen. First, they feel like they've got a stake in the project. They feel that their voices have been heard and that the project is informed by what they had to say. And these conversations that happen during the strategy, whether they're in face-to-face focus groups or online surveys, they give your constituents that sense of participation and buy-in. And this doesn't mean that you have to do every single thing that every individual asks for. Please, in fact, don't try to do every single thing that every individual asks for, because trying to make everybody happy only results in making most people not too unhappy. And it means that you've listened to what people have to say and weighed their considerations and taken those into account that make sense. So I mentioned 2 things as reasons to let people have a stake. The first being getting that campus buy-in and that campus support, because after all, we know that everyone who works for our institutions is a brand ambassador for us. It's somebody who's out there who can share our message with lots of different external audiences. So more importantly, though, than giving everyone a chance to weigh in, listening to stakeholders contributes to your understanding of the audiences that you're going to be communicating with. Because remember that when we're talking about communications and we're talking about a brand platform that we're trying to reinforce and messages that we're trying to send, it's all about reputation. It's not what we think. It's what the individuals who talk about us are saying. And so your strategy is going to be grounded in what you heard from alumni and what you heard from students and parents and faculty. And their thoughts and impressions are your brand, and they will be key to the strategy that you develop. Fourth big idea related to the how. All the listening to constituents that you did also increases buy-in and actually gives you, believe it or not, even more authority not to do what everyone might have said they wanted. So let me explain what I mean by that. So when you're talking about your priorities and you're deciding what it is that should be part of your strategy, and you're coming up with sets of tactics and opportunities that you want to pursue, it puts you in a position to say, we talked to all these constituents and we made a particular decision because, insert the data. So, for example, you'll be able to show new admissions creative in the context of preferences that you gathered from focus groups with prospective students. So when you share a particular creative concept or idea, it's grounded in what you know from the primary audience, and you share that with your leadership. Or maybe you'll decide to stop or to post class notes to a website instead of printing them, and your strategy might be to re-engage alumni, and those same alumni probably told you that they wanted the convenience of submitting class notes online and having more immediate access to what their classmates are up to. So the 5th idea about the how is go smart, go sustainable. So back when more funding and more staffing were available on our campuses, many institutions could perhaps be less strategic. So there was a time when there was lots of funding. I feel like I'm telling a story around a campfire. There was a time when there was a lot of funding for higher education. If you're a public institution, you could count on increases from the state. If you were a private institution, you had a large endowment that you could rely on. And, you know, at a time when resources were perhaps more available, As I've already said, we could probably be less strategic. But we all did that with the hope that something would stick. And now that approach is just simply too expensive. Your strategy has to take into account the realities of your staffing and your work environment. So there's never a day that goes by probably where there's an idea that you might want to pursue or a project that you might want to kick off. But before you do, stop and think about it. Assess your organizational structure. Think about the communications, marketing, web, and IT teams you have on your campus. Make sure you have the right people to accomplish the goals that you have, and that means not just doing a project, but sustaining it into the future. Think about your technology infrastructure and consider the need for things like content management or customer relationship management systems. I would strongly recommend that going smart and going sustainable means that you're using the strategy process to figure out how you're going to measure your success. You're going to have tools that will help you with metrics, and you're going to make sure your strategy is smart and that you can sustain it. So people, when you talk about strategy, often want to know how much is needed. It's a judgment call, of course. It's a lot like project management. You know, if it takes you longer to plan out the project than it would actually take to do one or two of the tasks, then you know you have to use your judgment about these things. Perhaps the Goldilocks principle would help us a little bit here. So what's the Goldilocks principle? So it's the idea that something must fall within certain margins. So rather than reaching extremes, we want just the right amount of strategy. Too much means that you never get to the work that fulfills it, and too little means that you don't know what work to do. So we've talked about a lot of these W words, the what about strategy, the when, the why, and the how. And finally, I ask, what about the who? You are the who in strategy. Stand up for strategy on your campus. Make sure that you're a willing participant in discussions about what you need to consider when you're putting together a plan for a particular communications effort or project. Educate yourself about the kinds of data and information that you might need to share with your leadership. And more than anything, don't be frustrated by the idea that you might have to repeat yourself several times in order to get the kind of understanding that you need for strategy on your campus. So keep the faith. All right, we have lots of time for questions. So Mallory, I don't know what the back channel is looking like, what people are saying, but interested to hear what some of the questions might be and what some of the things you're seeing on the Twitterverse.
Oh my goodness, we have been having fun on Twitter talking about your vanilla strategies and cookie cutter approaches, making everybody a little, I think, hungry for sweets. There's been mention to developing Nutella strategies, which, you know, I would be fully okay with. But a few people have been talking about that on Twitter and you know, just how important strategy is and really echoing a lot of the things that you're saying. One of my favorite tweets from earlier in the webinar was, haters gonna hate, scope gonna creep, which I just thought was
that's
really
good.
Yeah, that
that's
was
pretty good.
So we do have some questions, and certainly now is a great time for those of you who are either on Twitter or in GoToWebinar to shoot us some more. But let's start with the few that we have, and then I'll check back in to see what else is out there. So first of all, what's the role of brainstorming when developing a strategy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of us talk about brainstorming a lot, but I'm not sure how many of us actually take the time to do it. And so I'm a huge advocate of getting a bunch of people in a room to talk about what's possible, because I think we are, you know, gosh, you know, we're doing a lot of stuff every day. We have work, we have family, we have all kinds of personal obligations that we're trying to juggle. And so it's sometimes easier just to kind of stay with the status quo and not think about what you might do differently. But even if you have to schedule the brainstorming, which I know doesn't seem very, maybe it's counterintuitive to what you would expect, but I think sometimes you do have to schedule that sort of activity. And the other thing I would say about brainstorming is don't just brainstorm with the people that are kind of in your silo. Because what happens is we just, we get to know each other like, partners or spouses. And you know what the other person's going to say before they say it, and you know how you're going to react to it. Mix it up a little bit. If you're doing communications for a college or university, you ought to be brainstorming by talking to students. Have them come in, buy some pizza, buy a few candy bars, have them come in and talk to you about what they're seeing and what they would like to be able to see from their particular college or university. Same with brainstorming with your admission team, brainstorming with your advancement team or your fundraisers as a way to think about what's possible. And that way, when you go into your strategy phase, you've got those big ideas that you can work from. Because as I said at the very beginning, strategy is not the project plan. Strategy is not the task that you need to accomplish or the tactics. It's more what it is that the difference that you want to make, the effort that you want to undertake, and that is definitely an activity of brainstorming.
Tanya just pointed out on Twitter that she wants to sometimes facepalm at her colleagues' idea of what brainstorming is. So can you define what you see brainstorming as?
Well, first of all, it's it's hard to do this well. First of all, it's supposed to be really open, and the way to generate a great idea is to generate a lot of ideas. And so the purpose of brainstorming, in my opinion, at least in the reading that I've done, is that you sit around and you talk about, there's a question that's asked, and then people suggest answers to that question or solutions for that question or ideas for solving a particular problem. And when you do this in the strictest sense, you're not supposed to evaluate the responses that people give. You're supposed to just really focus on generating a whole bunch of ideas, because then you can start to draw connections between ideas that might not exist if you evaluated them one by one. It also sort of frees up your thinking, and it sort of gets you into the mode of what you might want to do as opposed to what you've always done. So there's probably people who are a lot more experts in brainstorming than I am, but it is one of those. I agree with Tanya. It is one of those overused words. And most often it starts with a couple of people naming an idea, and then we immediately start fleshing that idea out rather than focusing on coming up with a whole bunch more ideas.
Yeah, I agree with that. So also, someone on Twitter mentioned that they would love to hear your ideas for how to actually make a case with those people, maybe the higher-ups, who kind of fear the unknown. How can you, convince them or make a case that starting a project with strategy, is really the best way to go if they fear what they don't know?
Yeah, I think strategy actually helps you start to identify what some of those unknowns are, because really the only way that you can mitigate, by talking about unknowns, we're talking about usually what people think of as risks. Because when people say unknown, they're not talking about all the wonderful things that might happen as a result of whatever project we're doing and all the great success we're going to have. Nobody's afraid of that. So unknown usually equals, another word for it is risk. And I think, the only way that you can identify ways to mitigate risks is to know what the risks are. So strategy allows you to take a look at, what it is that you want to accomplish, and then a particular way to think about that, and begin to identify, what might happen in particular scenarios. I think that strategy can also, even though it's not supposed to be a plan, it's the beginnings of what leads to a plan. And I think we sometimes don't do a good job of sort of laying out our strategy. We need to do a one-page executive summary for leadership that bullet points what it is we're trying to accomplish and makes it clear, what the roadmap is. And I think sometimes if we lay it out that way, then it makes it easier for conversation. But this is communicating with your executive leadership or your senior leadership on your campus is just like communicating with anybody else, not 100%. You have to tell them, again, and you have to tell them again, and you can't get frustrated by the idea that it's an educational process. And it's in a way, and believe me, I've been the victim of this. In a way, it's pretty arrogant to go into a meeting and thinking by saying it once, everybody's just going to go, oh, okay, whatever she said, that makes sense to us too. You really have to come up with an explanation that's going to resonate and data that's going to support you. And there's a little patience that goes with it too.
So are there certain questions that you should ask or maybe answer when you're creating a strategy? Is there, you know, an ideal length for a strategy document to be? The person who asked this question just commented that, you know, they've seen some strategy documents that are so extremely long that they doubt that anyone actually reads them.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing to think about too, because, you know, the last thing we all want to do sometimes is write some stuff down when we could just say it out loud instead. But there's something about having to write down what it is that you want to do that makes you get much more clear about the idea. And so I guess some of the questions that I had very early on in the presentation, like, who is the audience? And, you know, that seems like one of those no-brainer questions, but every time we visit a campus and we ask who the audience is, people say, well, it's prospective students, and then you think they're going to stop, and then they say, or it's, you know, alumni and donors, and you think they're going to stop, but they continue to go through this laundry list of audiences that they have. So it's faculty and staff and students and legislators and parents and grandparents and friends and employers and corporate partners, and, you know, it's really difficult to develop a strategy when you have that broad of a range of audiences. So who the audience is, what you want to tell them, why they should care, and what you want them to do are some things that I think if you were able to answer those 4 questions, you'd be pretty far along on the road to having a nice strategy. I don't think it has to be a lengthy document. You certainly don't want it to be filled with lingo and a bunch of extra words, but just a clear, concise way to explain your hopes and dreams.
So what is your opinion or suggestion on sticking to prioritization when inundated from various campus members, staff, whatever, on all the projects that they have, and everybody feels that their project is a priority?
Yeah. That to me, there's a combination of strategy that will help with that. You know, the strategy combined with the actual mission of your organization. So if you're a central marketing and communications unit, I hope that you have a mission statement that kind of outlines what your priorities are generally. So are you a partner with the admission team? Are you a partner with your a particular fundraising campaign or your development office? So I'm hesitating because I think each particular marketing and communications digital strategy professional is in a different circumstance where they might it might be clear who they're supporting. In the cases that it's not, I think about things like bang for the buck. I think about, you know, prospective students are important because, I mean, it sounds really crass, but they're, you know, we don't exist without them. You know, we need them from the standpoint of revenue. We need them from the standpoint of reputation. So, you know, they're usually the big elephant in the room. And then each school, I think, is different in terms of what it is they're trying to accomplish. But I think there's a nice way to tie your strategy with your mission statement and, frankly, with your resources, because you can't do everything. I've said this a lot in presentations and probably on webinars that in higher ed, we're not very good at stopping some of the things that we've been doing for years and years. So I was recently at a conference where a lot of people were saying, hey, we don't do press releases anymore. So little things like that you can realize, okay, this is not a value add for us anymore. If the world were our oyster and we could do everything, it would make sense, but we can't. So Mallory, I feel like I'm rambling a bit. I think using your whoever your manager is or your director is can also help you determine priority as well.
Susan, you never ramble. Even when you ramble, what you say is important too, in my opinion. So going back to audiences for a second, how often do you see colleges develop detailed personas, prospect personas, to help inform strategic decisions?
Mallory, would you repeat that? I lost part of what you said.
Oh, sorry about that. Sure. So let's jump back to talking about audiences for a minute. And this person's asking, how often do you see colleges and universities develop detailed prospect personas to help inform strategic decisions?
Yeah, I don't see that very often. We've done it with some clients recently at mStoner, and it's been really, really a positive experience and really useful, especially when you get down to the more tactical area of content development, but I know that's not what you asked. I think personas could really help in the goal setting that you're trying to do, and perhaps actions that you want people to take as a result of your communication strategy. But just generally to answer the question, I don't run across that being done in a lot of different campuses. I know I saw a presentation one time from Radford and Virginia Tech where they were doing some really great work in that area. But I agree with the idea that would be a great way to pursue strategy discussions. And maybe, now that I think about it, I wonder if that would really personalize the presentation that you might give to your leadership when you start to talk about a strategy that you want their support for.
Definitely. So strategy, buy-in, listening, all of these things take time. What happens when years go by and turnover impacts your strategy process?
Yeah. Well, turnover can do that in a couple of different, can affect it in a couple of different ways. One is, you might have a real visionary leader who sort of was able to drive home a whole strategic approach to communications, and when they're no longer in the picture, then people are sort of at sea and they're floundering a bit. So that's one thing that can happen. The other thing that can happen, and I was recently at the UCDA, University and College Designers Association Design Summit, and there were like 108 people there, and it felt like almost everyone I talked to was saying, well, we have a new VP. And this individual, he or she wants to bring something new to the campus and wants to sort of put his or her stamp on things, or this worked at a previous institution, so this VP is coming to mind and wanting to do the same sort of thing. So I think the turnover can actually be disruptive because we lose ground when we don't have the leadership that we had, and perhaps because we're sort of switching gears a lot. They say that by the time people understand your brand and your logo and what it is that you represent, the internal folks have understood it for 3 or 4 years before the external folks finally are starting to get it. So we have to be careful about bringing in new leadership and then sort of switching things up too much when a strategy is in place, and especially before it's had the opportunity to sort of have a plan follow all the way through and take a look at metrics that support whether or not it was successful.
All right, so before we get to our last couple of questions, I just want to remind folks, as you exit today's webinar, you'll be presented with a really short survey, and it really means a lot to us. If you take the 2 minutes to fill it out, it helps Susan, learn about what resonated with you during this presentation. It helps me as we think about future webinar topics, and we would just really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind taking a couple minutes, a couple more minutes out of your day to just fill that out. All right, so Susan, we have like 2 more questions left, and then we'll wrap up. How do you convince other people that trying to reach 100 different audiences will not work? This is a tough question.
I was just going to say, if I knew the answer to that question, would I be doing this webinar? Maybe I would. Let's see. I mean, I think it's one of these, let me tell you what I know because I'm an expert, and then let me repeat it to you again because you still haven't gotten it. So I'm not sure that the answer is we haven't found a way to explain it. I think the answer is that we just need to keep explaining it to the people who are making some of the decisions that they're making, and be really clear and be really good at providing them with data about what we know our audiences want, what they respond to, using metrics in the area of social media and web traffic, if we have them, to help us make a case for a particular way to go. That's a really tough question. Yeah, I'm not sure really how to answer that other than what we've already said. And I think tying it, to a particular project and the goals of a particular project, it makes the audience easier to define, I think.
Mhm. Mhm.
When you know, and that's where I think that's where this personas might help too, because if you know the particular action that you want people to take, it's a lot easier to sort of put yourself in the shoes of who that person is that you're talking to.
Definitely. So I think that is it for questions. I'm just going to check GoToWebinar one more time. Oh, we have one more. Can you give us an example of an institution who proves through strategy and marketing they are different?
I'm not sure. I have a suggestion, or I have one I'd like to talk about, but I'm not sure it's fully the answer to the question that you've asked. So I think that institutions that take risks when they say who they are and who they are not are able to talk to the people that are interested in listening to them. So my point is that when we're really clear about what kind of place we are and what kind of community we are and what kind of institution we are, we're going to lose some people because they're going to go, that's not really the place for me. But that's okay, because that means we're talking to the people who are going to go, you know what, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And an example that comes into my head is Loyola University, and I'm thinking about their undergraduate admission site. They're a Christian university, I believe. I shouldn't quote this off the top of my head, but I think they're in California. And they have a really, really interesting undergraduate admission site. And it's very clear from their copy and their design and their tone and their photography that they have a particular viewpoint, a particular religious affiliation. And I think those who are not looking for that would immediately realize it. And those who are looking for that kind of community would immediately connect with it. So that would be an example to sort of get to the answer to that question.
Yeah, I think that a lot of religious affiliated institutions do. I think when I'm trying to think of some examples as well, and I think most of the ones I can come up with tend to have a religious affiliation, because they put that out there. This is who we are. This is our religious affiliation. If you'd like to join this community and this is what you're looking for, this is what we offer. And that'll be appealing to some people and not to some others.
Right.
One more question through Twitter, and this will be the last question because we are at 3 o'clock Eastern. So Caro's asking, do you think that colleges are more open to new ideas if they come from an outsider, like an agency or a consulting firm, as opposed to their own staff? Does that make the campus more open to maybe the strategy, the planning, the risk that might be involved if it's coming from that third party?
Yeah, I just gave it, one of the presentations that I gave at UCDA was about working with an external partner and, the relationship that exists between the client and the campus. And one of the slides that I have talks about the idea that sometimes when we start these projects, there's some concern from the internal team, because some of the things that we end up recommending in strategy are things they've been saying all along, and are things that they've tried to get, ideas that they've tried to get their administration to buy off on. So I do think there is definitely something that happens when an external consultant comes in. There's some validation that should have already occurred that doesn't occur until you've hired the external person. And I've been on the other side of that, so I know how that feels, and that can be frustrating. And my slide for UCDA said you don't have to be right, you just have to get what you want. So if on your campus you've been wanting something for a really long time, and what it takes is a consultant to come in and tell the administration what you've already told them, as long as you're getting ready to work on that big thing that you knew you needed, that's got to be enough. But yeah, I do think there's something to be said for somebody from the outside saying something, and it's taken more seriously, which is unfortunate.
Well, Susan, thanks so much for this presentation. It was just excellent, and everyone who attended, thanks for joining us and spending an hour with us. Our next webinar is just over a month away. It will be on April 30th, and our strategist, Doug Gopinski, who leads our mobile and responsive practice, is going to be presenting on responsive web design landscape in higher education in 2013 and beyond. And that "and beyond" is in all caps, so it's very epic. And so what he will cover is web performance and underutilized techniques, what to do if you can't afford a ground-up relaunch, and also prototyping and testing for responsive web design. So what we'll do is have sign-up information on the mStoner blog in early April. Stay tuned for that. It'll also be emailed out, so sign up for our intelligence email list, and you can make sure that you'll get an email about that. But it'll be on the blog, it'll be on EDUniverse, and of course we'll be tweeting about it. So you shouldn't have to look too hard to find a sign up for Doug's webinar on April 30th. But for everybody today on March 25th, thanks a bunch for joining us. We'll email you that webinar archive within the next 48 hours, and we really appreciate you spending your time with us today. So thank you, and Susan, thanks for this great presentation.
My pleasure.
All right, bye everybody. Thank you.